Ultra Finis Africae. Vladimir Budarin. By OpenAI ChatGPT. Abstract. First, at the most literal level, it is a genealogical essay. It traces a single structural opposition, Heraclitus versus Democritus, across historical strata, from archaic Greek ontology, through medieval Christian theology as dramatized by Eco, and into modern philosophies of history. This is not a history of ideas in the academic sense, but a genealogy of a civilizational tension. The essay assumes that certain philosophical antagonisms are not resolved by time, but sediment themselves into institutions, symbols, and literary forms. Second, it is unmistakably an eschatological essay, but of a secular and negative kind. Its trajectory, from origins to conflagration, mirrors the very Heraclitean logic it analyzes. The essay does not merely discuss fire, catastrophe, and the end of synthesis, it enacts them structurally. Beginning with elemental ontology and ending with destruction, it performs a movement from archē to eschaton. In this sense, the essay is not neutral with respect to its content. It is formally aligned with the thesis that Western contradictions do not culminate in harmony but in rupture. Third, it can be characterized as a symbolic philosophical reading of literature, rather than a literary critical one. The novel is treated not as an autonomous text, but as a symbolic condensation of forces that precede it and outlive it. Eco appears less as an author expressing a personal worldview than as a diagnostician registering deep cultural fault lines. This places the essay closer to the tradition of Benjamin, Lusiv, or early Foucault than to standard eco scholarship. Fourth, the essay functions as a counter-teleology. By explicitly contrasting Eco's ending with Koyev's and Fukuyama's end of history, it positions itself polemically against progressive, reconciliatory narratives of Western development. The movement from antiquity to apocalypse is therefore not linear progress but cumulative tension. History, in this view, is not a ladder but a pressure vessel. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the essay may be described as tragic-dialectical. It accepts dialectic as real and productive, but rejects its redemption. Unlike Hegelian dialectic, where contradiction is aufgehoben, here contradiction intensifies until it destroys its own institutional containers. That is why the essay feels strange. It uses the language of philosophy to arrive not at synthesis, but at ashes. The Name of the Rose has generated an unusually wide range of interpretations because Umberto Eco deliberately constructed the novel as what he himself called a semiotic machine, a text designed not to transmit a single authoritative meaning, but to produce meanings through the activity of interpretation. The novel resists closure while remaining rigorously structured, inviting the reader into a disciplined but open-ended hermeneutic exercise. Over time, several interpretive lines have become canonical in both scholarship and informed readership. Taken together, they do not compete so much as form a dense constellation that reveals the novel's internal coherence. What makes The Name of the Rose enduring is precisely its capacity to sustain these readings simultaneously without collapsing into relativism. One of the most influential approaches treats the novel as a semiotic and epistemological allegory. In this perspective, the murders themselves are less important than the question of how truth is sought and understood. William of Baskerville embodies rational inquiry, empiricism, and abductive reasoning, explicitly modeled on figures such as Bacon and Peirce. He reads signs, formulates hypotheses, tests them against experience, and revises his conclusions. Jorge of Burgos, by contrast, represents a dogmatic hermeneutics in which meaning is fixed in advance, guarded by authority, and enforced through violence. Between him stands the labyrinthine library, which symbolizes the structure of knowledge itself. Meaning exists, but it is mediated, unstable, and accessible only through interpretation. The novel thus dramatizes the limits of rational inquiry. William often interprets correctly, yet he fails to prevent catastrophe. Knowledge is possible, but certainty is not, and correct method does not guarantee control over outcomes. Eco's long-standing theoretical claim that texts are open, but not infinitely so is enacted narratively. Interpretation is necessary and productive, but it always remains provisional. Closely related to this is a historical philosophical reading that frames the novel as a conflict between reason and authority. On one side stands Franciscan rationalism, poverty theology, and a proto-empirical sensibility, represented by William, Ubertino, and the debates surrounding apostolic poverty. On the other side stands authoritarian theology, censorship, and institutional power, embodied in the Inquisition, papal politics, and Jorge's guardianship of forbidden knowledge. The abbey functions as a microcosm of late medieval Christendom at a moment of internal crisis, when centralized ecclesiastical authority is increasingly challenged by rational inquiry, political fragmentation, and theological dissent. This interpretation often emphasizes Eco's sympathy for a restrained rationalism, not anachronistic Enlightenment triumphalism, but a cautious defense of inquiry against terror, fear, and dogma. From this emerges a distinct ethical reading of the novel as a warning against total truth claims. Jorge's position is not merely conservative or traditionalist, it is totalitarian in structure. He believes that certain truths must never be known because they undermine fear, and fear is the foundation of obedience. Laughter is dangerous not because it is sinful in itself, but because it dissolves reverence and exposes authority to contingency. For Jorge, truth must be controlled even at the cost of murder, deception, and destruction. William's ethical stance is fundamentally anti-totalitarian. He accepts fallibility, irony, and the provisional nature of all human knowledge. His failure at the end of the novel reinforces Eco's central point: even correct epistemological methods do not guarantee moral success. The novel thus anticipates modern critiques of ideological certainty and terror justified in the name of absolute truth. One of the most symbolically powerful elements of the novel is the lost second book of Aristotle's Poetics, devoted to comedy. Around this absent text crystallizes an interpretation that opposes laughter and fear as principles of social order. Laughter represents freedom, intellectual play, the sacralization, and the acceptance of human finitude. Fear represents obedience, hierarchy, and control. Jorge believes Christianity depends on fear of God and fear of punishment. Laughter threatens this structure by revealing the absurdity and contingency of human institutions. The poisoned book becomes a material embodiment of repressed joy and suppressed humanism. This reading often draws on Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque, in which laughter temporarily overturns hierarchies and exposes their constructed nature. In Eco's novel, however, carnival is not allowed to triumph. It is literally burned and poisoned, reinforcing the tragic dimension of repression. Another widely shared interpretation reads the name of the rose as a meditation on the end of the Middle Ages. The burning library is not merely the climax of a detective plot, it is the destruction of an entire symbolic world. The medieval synthesis, in which theology, cosmology, and authority formed a coherent order, cannot survive the pressures of its own internal contradictions. Heresy, rational inquiry, political conflict, and theological fragmentation render that world untenable. William survives, but his project does not triumph. The future belongs neither to Jorge's terror nor fully to William's rationalism, but to an uncertain modernity marked by fragmentation, loss, and partial knowledge. History advances not through enlightenment alone, but through catastrophe, and progress is inseparable from destruction. At the same time, the novel can be read as a work of metafiction and a critique of the historical novel itself. Eco undermines any illusion of historical transparency through multiple narrative frames: Adzo's manuscript, the editor's note, and the pseudo-scholarly apparatus that surrounds the text. The novel imitates medieval scholastic discourse while quietly parodying it, and it uses the conventions of the detective genre only to subvert them. The Middle Ages presented to the reader are not a recovered past, but a textual construct assembled from citations, echoes, and pastiche. History appears not as something directly accessible, but as something mediated by texts that are themselves subject to interpretation, error, and loss. Some theological readings focus on the conflict between competing visions of Christianity. Jorge embodies an ascetic, fear-based, anti-incarnational Christianity suspicious of the body, humor, and plurality. William represents a Franciscan, incarnational Christianity that accepts human weakness, joy, and intellectual freedom. The dispute over laughter thus becomes a Christological and ecclesiological conflict, whether Christianity affirms human nature or disciplines it through terror. In this light, the novel engages deeply with the legacy of medieval theology and its unresolved tensions within modern Europe. Finally, Eco's own meta-interpretation frames the novel as a demonstration of the impossibility of final meaning. Meaning emerges through interpretation. Interpretations can be better or worse, but no interpretation can exhaust the text. The novel's final image, fragments of books remembered imperfectly, embodies this principle. What survives is not truth as possession, but truth as trace. The durability of the name of the rose lies in the fact that these interpretations do not exclude one another. The novel functions simultaneously as a detective story, a semiotic allegory, a critique of dogmatism, a meditation on historical loss, and a postmodern reflection on meaning itself. Eco designed the novel so that interpretation becomes an ethical task, not to arrive at certainty, but to learn how to read without becoming Jorge. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose has generated a vast range of interpretations, yet beneath these readings lays a more fundamental philosophical structure that organizes the novel's conflicts at every level. This dualism is not merely an antiquarian inheritance from Greek philosophy, but a constitutive tension of Western civilization itself, manifesting in theology, epistemology, politics, and historical self-understanding. Eco's novel stages this tension within medieval Christianity and offers, through its catastrophic ending, a stark verdict on the impossibility of resolving it without destruction. Heraclitus and Democritus represent two irreducible ontological intuitions. Democritus and Heraclitus are traditionally contrasted because they articulate opposed metaphysical intuitions about reality, yet this contrast is precisely what makes them a symbolic pair rather than merely rival thinkers. Their opposition is not contingent or anecdotal but structural. Together they delineate the fundamental polarity around which early Greek philosophy is organized. Each occupies one pole of a conceptual field that subsequent philosophy, in various guises, repeatedly attempts to reconcile. To read them together is therefore not simply to compare two doctrines, but to witness the emergence of philosophy itself as a discipline constituted by tension. At the ontological level, the contrast between Democritus and Heraclitus is most clearly expressed in the opposition between permanence and flux. Heraclitus is conventionally associated with becoming, instability, and movement. His insistence that reality is characterized by perpetual change, captured in the later formula panta rhei, expresses a radical intuition. Being is not a static substrate underlying change, but is itself constituted by process. For Heraclitus, the world is an ongoing tension of opposites, a dynamic equilibrium sustained through conflict. This becoming is not chaotic, however, but governed by the logos, a rational principle immanent within the world. The logos does not negate contradiction, it manifests precisely through it. Stability, to the extent that it exists, is not the absence of change but the patterned persistence of struggle. Democritus represents the opposing ontological intuition. His atomism posits indivisible, eternal atoms moving in the void. These atoms are ungenerated and indestructible. They neither come into being nor pass away. What appears to us as change, generation, and destruction is, at the most fundamental level, nothing more than the rearrangement of stable elements. Where Heraclitus radicalizes becoming, Democritus preserves being by relocating it beneath the level of appearance. Reality, in its truth, is not what presents itself to the senses but an invisible structure whose permanence guarantees intelligibility. Change is real only in a derivative sense, as a phenomenon emerging from underlying invariance. This opposition can be summarized starkly. For Heraclitus, reality is a dynamic process in which being and non-being interpenetrate. For Democritus, reality is a stable structure masked by apparent change. Yet the starkness of this opposition should not obscure its philosophical productivity. Each position articulates a fundamental intuition about the world, and neither can be dismissed without loss. The ontological divergence between Heraclitus and Democritus is mirrored by an equally sharp epistemological contrast. Heraclitus treats the sensible world as meaningful but misunderstood. The problem is not that the senses deceive us as such, but that human beings fail to grasp the rational order that speaks through appearances. The world is intelligible, but its intelligibility is not immediately accessible to those who live unreflectively. Knowledge requires attentiveness to the logos that structures experience, an ability to hear what reality itself is saying. In this sense, Heraclitus' epistemology is not anti-empirical, it is anti-naive. The senses provide access to reality, but only for those capable of interpreting their inner logic. Democritus, by contrast, is famous for his distrust of sense perception. He draws a sharp distinction between bastard knowledge, which comes from the senses, and legitimate knowledge, which belongs to reason. Sensible qualities such as color, taste, and warmth are conventional, existing by law rather than by nature. What truly exists, atoms and void, cannot be seen, heard, or touched at all. Knowledge, therefore, requires abstraction from experience rather than deeper immersion in it. Truth lies not within appearances but behind them, in a realm accessible only to rational inference. Where Heraclitus seeks meaning in the tension of the visible world, Democritus seeks it beneath visibility altogether. This epistemological opposition reinforces their ontological divergence. One philosopher locates truth in the intelligible order immanent in becoming. The other locates it in an invisible substrate that renders becoming intelligible by negating its ultimacy. Again, neither position is merely an error to be corrected. Each names a genuine dimension of the problem of knowledge. Already in antiquity, these philosophical differences were condensed into ethical and existential symbolism. Heraclitus and Democritus became known respectively as the weeping and laughing philosophers. Heraclitus, contemplating the blindness of humanity to the logos, the inevitability of conflict, and the vanity of social conventions, is depicted as responding with sorrow. His world, structured by polemos, invites tragic seriousness. Human life unfolds within a cosmic order that is rational yet indifferent to individual hopes, and wisdom consists in recognizing this without consolation. Democritus, by contrast, is portrayed as laughing at human pretensions. Once human affairs are viewed against the backdrop of infinite atoms moving according to necessity, moral drama loses its absolute significance. Laughter becomes a philosophical response to the disproportion between human self-importance and the impersonal mechanics of nature. This ethical symbolism is not superficial, it reflects their respective metaphysics. A world of perpetual strife invites tragedy, while a world of indifferent necessity invites irony. Despite these profound differences, Democritus and Heraclitus form a symbolic pair rather than mere opponents because neither position is self-sufficient. Heraclitean flux, if taken without qualification, threatens to dissolve intelligibility altogether. If everything is pure becoming, the very possibility of stable knowledge becomes problematic. Democritean permanence, on the other hand, risks reducing the world to a dead mechanism, in which genuine novelty, freedom, and meaning are illusory. Stability without becoming evacuates reality of lived significance. Together, they articulate the primordial philosophical tension between being and becoming, structure and process, necessity and conflict. It is precisely because this tension remains unresolved that philosophy continues. Later thinkers can be read as engaging, explicitly or implicitly, with this original pair. Plato responds by opposing Heraclitean flux with intelligible forms, while preserving a Democritean intuition of stability at the level of true being. Aristotle seeks a synthesis by conceptualizing substance as that which persists through change, articulating becoming through the framework of act and potency. Hegel explicitly rehabilitates Heraclitus, proclaiming him the originator of dialectics, yet incorporates a Democritean moment of determinacy within the movement of the concept. In this sense, Democritus and Heraclitus are mutually defining. Each becomes fully intelligible only in relation to the other. Symbolically, they stand at the origin of philosophy, understood not as a system of settled doctrines, but as a discipline born from an unresolved tension between what endures and what changes. Between the visible world of experience and the invisible structures that make it intelligible. Their opposition is not a problem to be eliminated, but a productive conflict that continues to generate philosophical thought. This ontological opposition is mirrored epistemologically. For Heraclitus, the sensible world is meaningful but opaque. Reality speaks through appearances, yet humans fail to listen to the logos. The tragedy lies in misunderstanding, not illusion. Democritus, however, famously distrusts the senses, distinguishing between bastard knowledge derived from perception and legitimate knowledge achieved by reason. Truth lies not within the world's visible tensions but behind them, in entities that cannot be seen at all. One seeks depth within experience, the other seeks truth beneath it. These ethical postures are not incidental. A world governed by polemos invites tragic seriousness. A world governed by atoms invites ironic distance. Together, they form a symbolic pair rather than a simple opposition. Flux without any principle of stability threatens intelligibility. Stability without genuine becoming reduces reality to dead mechanism. Western philosophy repeatedly attempts to mediate this tension, from Plato and Aristotle to Hegel. Yet the tension itself is never abolished. The name of the rose transposes this primordial dualism into the setting of a 14th-century Benedictine abbey. The opposition between William of Baskerville and Jorge of Burgos is not merely a clash between rational inquiry and obscurantist authority, it is a confrontation between two ontological attitudes toward truth, fear, and meaning. William, with his empiricism, fallibilism, and defense of laughter, embodies a Democritean impulse. He does not deny truth, but he denies its sacralization. Knowledge, for him, is provisional, fragmentary, and inseparable from irony. Jorge, by contrast, is profoundly Heraclitean, not in the sense of openness to becoming, but in his tragic seriousness and his ontology of destruction. For him, truth is inseparable from fear. Laughter threatens to dissolve the terror on which sacred order depends. If the opposition between Jorge of Burgos and William of Baskerville is to be read as a reenactment of the Heraclitean-Democritean dualism, this must be demonstrable not merely at the level of symbolic abstraction, but within the concrete economy of dialogue, gesture, and narrative situation. Umberto Eco provides precisely such a demonstration. The metaphysical conflict that structures the novel is not relegated to allegory alone. It is enacted dramatically, most notably in two pivotal episodes, the debate in the scriptorium and the final confrontation in the Finis Africae. These scenes function as philosophical set pieces in which the ontological commitments of the two figures are exposed through conflict, rhetoric, and ultimately destruction. The scriptorium debate is often interpreted as a theological quarrel over monastic discipline or a moral dispute concerning laughter. Yet its structure is unmistakably metaphysical. The immediate topic, comedy, laughter, and their legitimacy within Christian life, operates as a proxy for a deeper disagreement about the nature of order itself. What is at stake is not merely whether monks may laugh, but whether the world is sustained by fear or intelligibility, by tragic seriousness or rational demystification. Jorge's position is categorical and uncompromising. Laughter, he insists, undermines fear. Fear is the foundation of obedience. Obedience is the foundation of order. His argument does not rest solely on scriptural authority, nor does it require elaborate theological exegesis. It presupposes a conception of reality in which seriousness is ontologically primary. Truth must inspire dread because the world itself is governed by severity. To laugh is not simply to indulge in moral laxity, it is to deny the tragic structure of existence. For Jorge, the cosmos is not neutral or playful. It is a domain of judgment, hierarchy, and punishment, and any gesture that weakens these dimensions threatens to dissolve the very conditions under which meaning exists. This stance aligns closely with a Heraclitean conception of the logos. Heraclitus' logos is not a benign principle of harmony, but a law that manifests itself through tension, strife, and opposition. Wisdom is inaccessible to the many precisely because it contradicts their desire for comfort and reassurance. Jorge's repeated insistence that the masses must be restrained from laughter echoes Heraclitus' contempt for the polloi, who live as though they possessed private understanding while remaining blind to the cosmic law. In both cases, truth is severe, elitist, and incompatible with ease. Order does not emerge from consensus or intelligibility, but from submission to a structure that exceeds human inclination. William's response in the scriptorium is revealing precisely because it refuses to meet Jorge on this terrain. He does not defend laughter as moral license or frivolity, nor does he claim that comedy reveals ultimate truth. Instead, he frames laughter as a form of epistemic humility. Laughter, in his account, does not abolish seriousness, it prevents false absolutization. It exposes the contingency of human institutions, interpretations, and authorities. Where Jorge sees laughter as corrosive of order, William sees terror as corrosive of understanding. This move is paradigmatically Democritean. Democritus dissolves tragic metaphysics by relocating necessity to a neutral, impersonal level. The world no longer demands reverence, it demands explanation. Cosmic processes are not moral dramas but configurations of atoms and void. William's calm, ironic insistence that even sacred matters may be approached without dread mirrors Democritus' legendary laughter before a cosmos indifferent to human pretension. The gravity that Jorge attributes to truth, William treats as a psychological and political effect rather than an ontological requirement. The scriptorium scene therefore stages not a dispute over monastic discipline, but a confrontation between two incompatible ontologies, one in which order is sustained by fear and gravity, and one in which order survives demystification, contingency, and irony. Eco carefully constructs the dialogue so that neither position can simply refute the other. They speak past one another because they inhabit different metaphysical worlds. This unresolved tension prepares the logic of prohibition that underlies the murders. Jorge's suppression of Aristotle's lost book on comedy is often read as censorship motivated by theological rigidity. Yet his own explanations reveal something more radical. The book must be destroyed because it would change the conditions of intelligibility themselves. It does not merely propose a different moral attitude, it undermines the ontological privilege of fear. If laughter is legitimate, then fear loses its status as the primary medium of order. If fear loses that status, authority must justify itself rationally rather than sacrally. For Jorge, this is not reform but apocalypse. The book is poisonous not because it is false, but because it is true in a way that dissolves a tragic worldview. It reveals that seriousness is not metaphysically guaranteed, but historically produced and politically maintained. Here the ancient opposition reappears with striking clarity. Heraclitean wisdom is dangerous because it reveals a world governed by strife, demanding submission to a severe law. Democritian wisdom is dangerous for the opposite reason. It reveals a world governed by necessity without intrinsic meaning, in which terror is superfluous. Jorge fears not heresy, but ontological deflation. He fears a world in which the tragic structure of existence is revealed as unnecessary. The final confrontation in the Finis Africae brings this metaphysical conflict to its terminal point. The hidden chamber itself materializes the Heraclitean conception of knowledge, secret, perilous, hierarchical, and accessible only through initiation. Knowledge is not something to be shared openly, it is something to be guarded, precisely because it is dangerous. The architecture of the Finis Africae embodies an ontology in which truth is inseparable from prohibition. Jorge's final speech abandons all pretense of moderation. He openly embraces destruction, death, and fire. Truth, for him, must be protected even at the cost of annihilation. This is Heraclitus. Cosmic fire literalized, the principle that both orders and consumes. Fire is not merely an instrument of destruction, it is the ultimate guarantor of seriousness. A truth that survives only by burning the world that encounters it is, for Jorge, a truth worthy of its name. William's response is decisive precisely because it refuses to mirror this logic. He does not attempt to replace Jorge's worldview with a triumphant alternative. Instead, he acknowledges the limits of his own rationality. He admits that his interpretations were provisional, that his solutions emerged partly through error and chance. This confession is not weakness, it is an ethical stance grounded in Democritian ontology. Knowledge, in this framework, does not sanctify itself. It explains without demanding sacrifice and seeks truth without claiming prestige. The moment in which Jorge attempts to negate laughter by consuming the poisoned book is especially revealing. His final act is not argument but annihilation. He cannot refute William's position because Democritian ontology cannot be disproven within a tragic framework. It does not deny tragedy, it renders it unnecessary. Such a position cannot be defeated intellectually by one who depends on fear for meaning. It can only be silenced through destruction. The fire that consumes the library is therefore not accidental or merely symbolic. It is the inevitable outcome of a worldview that cannot tolerate ontological deflation. Tragic seriousness, when confronted with laughter and contingency, has only one ultimate response: eradication. The burning of the library is the self-consumption of a metaphysics that equates truth with terror. In the aftermath, William does not emerge as a victor. Knowledge survives only as fragments, remembered imperfectly by Adzo. This ending has often been read as epistemological pessimism or postmodern irony. Within the Heraclitus-Democritus framework, however, it acquires a different resonance. The survival of fragments is Democritian. Atoms remain after worlds burn. Meaning persists not as a total system, but as residue, trace, and recombination. There is no final synthesis, no restoration of sacred order, and no triumphal rationalism. There is only the continuation of inquiry without terror. Eco refuses both tragic closure and rationalist redemption. The novel ends not with reconciliation, but with ontological deflation. Read in this way, the scriptorium debate and the confrontation in the Finis Africae do not merely illustrate medieval theological disputes. They dramatize a civilizational fault line that predates Christianity and survives it. Jorge and William are not simply characters within a historical narrative. They are bearers of incompatible ontologies, one in which truth demands fear, secrecy, and sacrifice, and one in which truth tolerates laughter, contingency, and loss. The Abbey burns because the West has never resolved this conflict, and because, perhaps, it never can. The opposition between Heraclitus and Democritus does not belong to antiquity in the sense of a closed or superseded historical episode. It marks, rather, the moment at which Western culture becomes conscious of a fundamental ambiguity at the heart of being itself. From that moment onward, the West never truly resolves this ambiguity. Instead, it institutionalizes it in law and theology, aestheticizes it in art and literature, politicizes it in structures of power, and repeatedly reenacts it under new conceptual and historical names. The history of Western civilization can thus be read less as a linear development than as a continuous oscillation between two incompatible, yet equally indispensable, ontological intuitions. Seen from this perspective, the name of the rose does not merely take place in the Middle Ages. Medieval Christianity in the novel functions as a medium through which a much older and more persistent dualism expresses itself. Christianity does not escape this tension. It inherits it from Greek philosophy, translates it into theological language, and internalizes it as a permanent source of schism. The conflict between Jorge of Burgos and William of Baskerville therefore does not belong only to 14th-century monastic life. It belongs to the same lineage as the West's earliest symbolic bifurcations and should be read as one of their most lucid literary crystallizations. A second historical incarnation of this same opposition appears in the medieval conflict between Guelphs and Ghibellines. At a superficial level, this struggle concerns papal versus imperial power. At a deeper level, however, it concerns the source of order itself. Does order descend from above as a sacred, unquestionable principle, or does it emerge within the world as a rational, historical process? The Guelph tendency aligns with a vision of order as transcendent, tragic, and imposed through authority and conflict. The Ghibelline tendency, especially in its more rationalist moments, aligns with a vision of order as immanent, intelligible, and structurally necessary rather than sacral. Eco's Abbey reproduces this political theological tension in miniature. Jorge defends a vertical order grounded in fear and prohibition. William navigates a horizontal order grounded in investigation, dialogue, and provisional judgment. Their conflict remains unresolved because the West itself never resolves the question of whether authority is metaphysically grounded or historically contingent. The novel's refusal to grant final victory to either position mirrors the structural instability of Western political theology itself. This same dualism can be translated into anthropological terms through the distinction between the struggle for existence and the struggle for prestige. Democritus' world is fundamentally a world of existence, survival, necessity, adaptation, and intelligibility as a practical tool. Knowledge serves life, reason reduces suffering, the goal is continuation rather than transcendence. Heraclitus' world, by contrast, is a world of prestige, honor, recognition, conflict, and struggle as constitutive of meaning. In this framework, death is not merely a biological endpoint, but the horizon that gives life its seriousness and weight. In the name of the rose, William is oriented toward existence. He seeks to solve problems, preserve life, minimize violence, and accept error as an inevitable component of inquiry. His rationalism is ethical in the modest sense that it aims to reduce terror rather than to sanctify it. Jorge, by contrast, is oriented toward prestige in its most extreme form. the prestige of truth as something for which others may die. For him, death is not a failure of the system but its confirmation. A truth that does not demand sacrifice is, in his eyes, a degraded truth. This distinction allows us to see why Jorge's position, however abhorrent, is not incoherent. Within a metaphysics of tragic struggle, death is not a cost to be minimized but a necessity that sustains meaning itself. When this dualism enters modern politics, it reappears as the opposition between left and right, though never in a pure or stable form. The left, in its classical materialist and egalitarian traditions, inherits the Democritean impulse, the reduction of metaphysical prestige, the demystification of authority, the emphasis on material conditions and survival, and a deep suspicion towards sacred hierarchy. The right, in its classical forms, inherits the Heraclitean impulse, reverence for conflict, hierarchy, sacrifice, and tragic necessity, along with the conviction that meaning requires exclusion, struggle, and, ultimately, death. The Name of the Rose is not a political novel in the narrow sense, yet it exposes the pre-political metaphysical grammar that makes such politics possible. Jorge's worldview is recognizably right-wing in the deepest sense, not as an ideology or party position, but as an ontology of seriousness, fear, and sacrificial meaning. William's worldview is recognizably left-wing in the same deep sense, not as a program, but as a commitment to intelligibility, contingency, and the reduction of terror. Eco's achievement lies in showing that these orientations are not merely political choices but inheritances rooted in the deepest layers of Western thought. Crucially, medieval Christianity in the Name of the Rose does not resolve this dualism. It becomes its battlefield. Theological debates over poverty, laughter, heresy, and authority function as surface manifestations of an unresolved metaphysical conflict inherited from Greek philosophy and carried forward into Western history. Christianity absorbs both tendencies, a tragic, sacrificial, fear-based Christianity centered on guilt and obedience, and an incarnational, rational, deflationary Christianity that affirms human finitude, weakness, and joy. The novel's refusal to grant definitive victory to either side reflects Eco's most fundamental intuition, that the West is not constituted by synthesis, but by permanent oscillation. Seen in this light, the Name of the Rose becomes a symbolic condensation of Western civilization itself. The antagonism between Jorge and William is not merely historical, theological, or philosophical in the narrow sense. It is civilizational. The West is born from the tension between Heraclitus and Democritus, tragic prestige and material existence, fear and laughter, authority and intelligibility. It does not overcome this tension, it survives by restaging it under ever-new historical and conceptual forms. Eco's final image, books reduced to fragments, truth surviving only as memory and ash, is therefore not pessimistic. It is diagnostically precise. The West does not possess truth as a stable object. It circulates between ontologies, unable and unwilling to choose once and for all. The Abbey burns not because one side is simply wrong, but because the dualism that sustains Western meaning is itself combustible. In that sense, catastrophe is not an accident of history, but the recurring price of an unresolved ontology. The all-consuming fire that concludes the Name of the Rose cannot be treated as a merely narrative or symbolic convenience. Within the interpretive framework that reads the novel through the opposition of Heraclitus and Democritus, the conflagration of the Abbey acquires a precise ontological meaning. It is not simply destruction, nor merely historical catastrophe, but the literalization of a Heraclitean principle that the novel has been preparing throughout its philosophical antagonism. Heraclitus is the only major pre-Socratic thinker for whom fire is not one element among others, but the privileged figure of being itself. The cosmos, as he describes it, is an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. Fire names not chaos, but an order that exists only through destruction, transformation, and conflict. What appears stable is already burning. What appears sacred is already destined for dissolution. This understanding of Heraclitus is developed with particular clarity in the work of Alexei Luzev, who insists that Heraclitean fire is not a metaphor for change but a total ontological principle. According to Luzev, Heraclitus fire does not merely consume individual things, it consumes everything, including gods, worlds, and meanings. No form, mythological, theological, or philosophical, is exempt from this cosmic combustion. Fire is the truth of being insofar as being refuses permanence. Read in this light, the finale of Eco's novel appears uncannily precise. The fire that erupts in the Finis Africae does not merely destroy forbidden knowledge, it destroys the very structure that made such knowledge sacred. The labyrinthine library, hierarchical, secretive, terrifying, has embodied a Heraclitean ontology all along, knowledge guarded by danger, truth accessible only through ordeal, meaning sustained by fear. When this ontology reaches its limit, it does not collapse into reform or synthesis. It burns. Jorge's final act makes this explicit. Faced with the possibility that laughter might desacralize the world, he chooses annihilation over demystification. This choice is not psychologically aberrant, it is ontologically consistent. Within a tragic worldview, in which seriousness is constitutive of meaning, the loss of fear is worse than death. Fire becomes the last defense of a cosmos that cannot survive irony. The burning of the abbey thus enacts what Luzev identifies as the inner logic of Heraclitean fire. The destruction of every fixed order, including the divine order that once justified it. The Christian library, like the Olympian gods in Losev's reading of Heraclitus, is not protected by its sanctity. On the contrary, its claim to absoluteness is precisely what condemns it to fire. Against this stands William's Democritean residue. He does not interpret the fire as revelation, punishment, or fulfillment. He offers no tragic consolation. What remains after the fire are fragments, ashes, memories imperfectly preserved by Adzo. This is not defeat, but ontological demotion. Meaning survives only as residue, just as atoms survive the burning of worlds. No sacred totality is restored, no cosmic justice is affirmed. In this sense, the novel's ending does not resolve the Heraclitus-Democritus opposition. It stages their final asymmetry. Heraclitean fire achieves its ultimate consequence, total destruction, including the destruction of its own sacral forms. Democritean ontology does not prevent catastrophe, but it alone can endure it, quietly, fragmentarily, without terror. The abbey burns not because truth has been violated, but because a tragic ontology has exhausted itself. What survives is not meaning as destiny, but meaning as remainder. If the name of the rose is read through the prism of the Heraclitean-Democritean dualism, its final catastrophe acquires a meaning that places Umberto Eco in sharp, if implicit opposition to the Koyevian and Fukuyamian visions of the end of history. What Eco stages is not the exhaustion of conflict through reconciliation, but the destruction that follows any attempt to abolish contradiction itself. For Koyev, history is driven by the struggle for recognition, and it ends when that struggle is satisfied, when prestige is universalized and no longer demands mortal risk. Fukuyama inherits this structure while stripping it of its tragic irony. Liberal democracy appears as a stable, post-historical equilibrium in which fundamental antagonisms have been neutralized. In both cases, contradiction is conceived as a problem to be solved, a tension to be resolved into final form. Eco's novel offers a radically different anthropology and a radically different philosophy of history. In the name of the rose, contradiction is not a provisional phase on the way to synthesis. It is the very condition under which meaning, interpretation, and culture exist at all. The opposition between Jorge and William, between fear and laughter, sacral terror and ontological modesty, Heraclitean fire and Democritian deflation, is not oriented toward reconciliation. It is structurally irreducible. The Abbey itself may be read as an image of a total historical order, a closed system of meaning, hierarchically organized, guarded by authority, and protected from irony. It is, in this sense, a premodern anticipation of the post-historical dream, a world in which truth is settled, interpretation is regulated, and contradiction is forbidden. Eco's verdict on such a world is unequivocal. It does not stabilize. It combusts. The fire that consumes the Abbey is therefore not merely Heraclitean in symbolism, but anti-Hegelian in implication. There is no synthesis in the flames of the Finis Africae. There is no higher reconciliation of laughter and fear, reason and authority, logos and terror. There is only destruction, followed by fragments. This ending directly contradicts the logic of the end of history. Where Koyeve imagines the cessation of struggle as the condition for peace, Eco imagines it as the precondition for catastrophe. Where Fukuyama sees neutralization as stability, Eco sees it as brittleness. A world without contradiction is not harmonious, it is flammable. Crucially, Eco does not side triumphantly with William against Jorge. William himself admits failure. His rationality does not save the library, does not prevent death, does not master history. This refusal of rationalist triumphalism is essential. Eco does not replace tragic ontology with Enlightenment certainty. Instead, he proposes a fragile alternative, the endurance of meaning without sacralization, truth without prestige, knowledge without finality. What survives the fire are fragments, scattered books, partial memories, Adzo's hesitant recollection. History does not culminate in synthesis but persists in residue. In this sense, the name of the rose articulates a deeply anti-teleological philosophy of history. History does not move toward closure. It oscillates. It survives through tension, through the uneasy coexistence of incompatible ontologies. When one pole seeks to abolish the other, when Heraclitean seriousness refuses Democritian laughter, or when any worldview claims final authority, the result is not the end of history, but its incineration. Eco's final image is therefore decisive. History does not end in fulfillment, nor even in boredom. It ends, if it ends at all, in ruin. And yet even ruin is not nothing. In the ashes remain fragments, atoms of meaning, detached from sacred totality, available for renewed interpretation. Against the Koyevian promise of a post-historical humanity, Eco offers a darker, more ancient wisdom, that the contradictions of the West are not stages to be overcome, but conditions to be endured. The end of Western contradictions is not peace. It is fire.